and what you're trying to do with young people, get them interested in the construction industry and business. We certainly appreciate that. But I wanted, as I talked to you about the House Freedom Caucus, I kind of wanted to start with a question. I want you to think about people who impacted your life in a positive way. Who impacted your life in a positive fashion, and if you're anything like me, probably next to your parents, next to someone in your family, it was probably a coach or teacher you had along the way. And for me, it was my high school wrestling coach. I tell folks he was the toughest teacher in our school. He taught chemistry and physics. He was the toughest wrestling coach, I think, in the whole darn state of Ohio. And this is not an exaggeration. Coach McCunn passed away a few years ago. Tragic, actually. He was only early 60s. But had a tremendous impact on students and student athletes at our school. But he taught chemistry and physics. And I can still remember he talked about discipline every single day. I can remember he said, "Hey, Jordan, this isn't any class. This is chemistry class. More important, it's my chemistry class. And if you're going to do well in this class, it's going to take discipline. You're going to have to read the material the night before. You're going to have to come to class prepared, do the experiments. It's going to take discipline to do well in this class." And then the wrestling room, oh my goodness, it drove me crazy. I can still hear his speeches. Self-discipline is the most important character quality needed to accomplish anything of meaning, anything of significance. You want to attain any worthy goal, it takes discipline. I was like, would that guy shut up? He sounds like my dad, right? And he had a great definition of discipline. And at our school, wrestling is the big thing. My brother's the coach at our high school. They've won the state championship the last 17 years in a row, and in 2 weeks they're going to win it again. But in the Ron McCunn wrestling room at our high school, with all those state championship banners hanging up in the room, the biggest banner's on the front wall, and it's Coach McCunn's definition of discipline. And it says this: discipline, doing what you don't want to do when you don't want to do it. Back in the day, that meant doing things Coach's way when you'd rather do them your own way. It meant doing things the right way when you'd rather do them the easy way. It meant doing things the tough way when you'd rather do them the convenient way. And I would argue that the biggest problem in Washington today is way too often the folks in that town want to do things the easy way and the convenient way. And so a few years ago, Mike mentioned the House Freedom Caucus and asked me to talk a little bit about it. A few years ago, there was a group of 9 of us who said we need to form a group who's committed to doing things the tough way, the right way, not the easy way, not just kicking the can down the road, not just doing more deficit spending, not just pretending you're doing what you told the voters you were going to do, and when you get to Washington, not really doing it and coming up with excuses and reasons why you can't do what you know you should do, and frankly, what you told them you were going to do and what they elected you to do. And so we formed this group, and we're committed to doing just that. Doing our mission statement, we talk about the countless number of Americans who feel like Washington has forgotten them. Our job is to remember them and fight for them. And the interesting thing that happened, about the same time, frankly, shortly after we created this group, there was another guy who decided to, you probably remember this moment, ride the escalator down at Trump Tower and announce that he was going to run for president. And the conventional wisdom was, this guy has no chance to win. But he ran a campaign where he said he was going to take on the establishment, going to take on the swamp, and make some changes. And again, no one thought he could do it. I mean, I remember my wife and I, Polly and I, we went to the first debate. It was in Cleveland, Ohio, near part of our district. We went there, and remember, you know, after that debate, people said his campaign's done, he's finished, he can't win. And then shortly after, he'd say something else, say, oh, he can't win again. And it just kept going, but he just kept running, and then he just kept winning. And of course, we all know now that he's president of our great country. But there was a phenomenon that took place, and I tell this story because I think this captures what happened in that election, November 8th, 2016. And the way I describe it is all kinds of people around this country did something that, frankly, hadn't been done in a long, long time. I call them the second shift worker people, second grade teacher people. So I want you to imagine this scenario, which could play out in every single community across this country any given workday. But think about the guy who works second shift. Now remember, you work second shift, you miss half your kids' Little League games, You're missing their after-school activity. My dad worked some second shift. My dad worked mostly third shift, but he worked some second shift when I was a kid. And we hated it because he wasn't around as much. But here's a guy working second shift, working his tail off for his family. He goes out to get in his truck to drive to work, and as he's getting in his truck, he looks a couple houses down, and he sees a guy sitting on the front porch, reading the newspaper, drinking coffee. And the second shift worker knows the front porch sitter can work, but won't work, and is getting his money. He gets in his truck, driving to work, thinking about the guy back on the front porch. He's driving to work, he's got his radio on. It's the news hour. The reporter comes on and says the federal government's got a $20 trillion debt. They got this program that gives money to certain companies, some crazy program, some boondoggle program, wasted millions of dollars. He hears all that. He remembers the guy back on the front porch, and guess what? He's ticked off. And I would argue he has every right to be mad. Same time he's driving to work, there's a lady driving home from work. And she's a second grade teacher at the local school. And she, like all good teachers, like Coach McCunn, she views her job as a mission field to help her students get the skill set they need to start on the path to achieving the American dream. So she's busted her tail all day long. She's driving home from work. She happens to have her radio on, happens to be on the same station where she hears the same reporter say, federal government's got a $20 trillion debt. They got this program, gives money to certain companies. This one program is wasteful, costs the taxpayers millions of dollars. She hears all that as she pulls into her drive, which just happens to be on the same street where she sees the same guy sitting on the front porch, drinking coffee, reading the paper. She knows he can work and won't work and is getting her money. And guess what? She's mad too. And she has every right to be mad. And I would argue what happened November 8, 2016 is a bunch of second grade teachers and second shift workers said enough. They said the same thing that 9 of us in the Freedom Caucus said 3 years ago. Now 39 members in the Freedom Caucus said, we've had enough, and we're going to fight on the inside. But these people said, we're going to send someone from the outside to Washington who's going to shake that place up. And I would argue in the first year, that is exactly what has happened. Now, you wouldn't believe it if you listened to, CNN or MSNBC. But this first year, speaking of the press, I always tell my colleagues, the press, we get something, as Mike said, something about the Freedom Caucus every single day in the press is written about us as bad. Every time, every day. It'll be in there today. You can look at it. The Freedom Caucus, and most of the articles will be negative because the swamp doesn't like us. Any of you ever listened to Cal Thomas or read Cal Thomas, syndicated columnist? He had a great line when he was talking about, I tell my buddies, first of all, if the press isn't saying something bad about you, you're probably not doing anything any good. But Cal Thomas had a great line when he was talking about the way regular, normal Americans see things and the way the elite national media views things, like the New York Times and the Washington Post. Mr. Thomas said, I get up every morning, I read my Bible in the New York Times so I can see what each side's up to. And there's some truth to that, right? So the press always says something about, but if you think about the first year, regulations are down, the economy is up, taxes are down, the market is up, the individual mandate in Obamacare has been repealed, ISIS is on the defense, the embassy has gone to Jerusalem, and Neil Gorsuch is on the Supreme Court. Pretty darn good first year. Now, there's still work to be done. Lots of work to be done. But that's a pretty darn good start to changing the way that town operates. That's the good news. The bad news is the swamp they haven't quit. The establishment hasn't stopped. They're still fighting hard. And we saw an example of this just last, 11 days ago. Some of you may have followed this spending bill that passed. Second largest spending increase in the last decade, second only to the stimulus package in Obama's first year, $400 billion in just new government. Some of that was needed in defense, but a bunch of it wasn't, most of it wasn't. And this is exactly the opposite of what the voters sent us there to do as Republicans. So we got some work to do. And the big concern I had with that bill is we were so poised to win. How many remember 5 weeks ago when Chuck Schumer shut down the government? Remember this, right? Shut down the government, and he basically said amnesty for illegals is more important than funding our troops and keeping the government open. And the American people said, well, Mr. Schumer, we disagree with that. Remember this? He shut down the government for 3 days and then finally had a change of heart and said, wait a minute, I'm going to change my mind here because politically it just wasn't working for him. Well, so that was a short-term spending bill 2 weeks ago, and early in the week, we sent a bill to the Senate that did the exact same thing. Exact same bill with one exception. We said instead of just funding our troops for short term, we're going to fund them for the full year, and we're going to give our troops a pay raise, but we're not going to increase the rest of government. We're going to hold the line on the rest of government spending. And we sent that over, and again, we were right on we were poised to win. Because we sent that over, and instead of it, this is the part that drives us crazy as conservatives. Instead of standing firm in that position, instead of just having the debate and daring Chuck Schumer to do what he did before and shut the government down because he doesn't want to increase funding for the troops and he wants more spending on the rest of government, instead of standing firm in our position, unfortunately our leadership did what the swamp always does. They just said, well, let's just increase spending on everything. Not just defense, which constitutionally we're supposed to do, but everything else in government. We got this huge spending bill. So that's what we got to keep fighting. We got to get control of this spending and a host of other issues where the swamp still wants to do things that I just think aren't consistent with what the American people elected us to do. Let me just finish with one quick thought, because we do live in the greatest country ever. As Mike mentioned, my background's in wrestling. I talked a little bit about it with our coach. But if you ever get the chance to travel, I had, through the sport of wrestling, I had the opportunity a long time ago, I'm getting old, but this was in 1987, went to what was then the Soviet Union, been to Cuba a few times for competition, and I tell folks, you go to places like that, you thank the good Lord you live here. Shoot, I remember I was in Moscow in February. It's like 200 below zero. You definitely thank the good Lord you live here, and the food was terrible. But it is an amazing country, and I thought of this story as I was flying on the plane here this morning that has stuck with me. A couple summers ago, like I said, I'll close with this. A couple summers ago, my wife Polly and I, we live north of Dayton, Ohio. And we had some friends in the Dayton area invite us. They said, you're free for dinner, let's go down and have dinner. But before we go to dinner, we're going to take a tour of the Wright brothers' home. And we said, yeah, that's great. We have this, like this town, we have this amazing aerospace history in Ohio, and we like old homes. The house we live in, our home was built in 1837, so we like to say, sure, we'll do it. So we go down and they give you a tour of this place, and you learn all these interesting things about the Wright brothers, these two amazing Ohioans, two amazing Americans. And it was all good, and you learn all kinds of neat things, but this part that stuck with me was the last room you're in is one of the brothers' bedrooms. And they're talking a little bit about this particular, I forget which one it was, but they're talking about him. And then they hold up the picture. The picture we all remember from school, that first flight, 1903, Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, where these guys flew like 100 some feet, a couple of hundred feet. It was like a 59-second, 1-minute flight. Barely got off the ground in this contraption they called an airplane. And you see that picture and you're like, wow, that's neat. I remember that from school, whenever you learned that in middle school or high school, whatever. They put that picture down and they hold up a second picture. 44 years later, 1947, Chuck Yeager breaking the sound barrier. And that I didn't know. And I'm like, wow, that's amazing. Think about it. In 44 years, two guys flying a couple hundred feet, 59 seconds, they were off the ground, to 44 years later, another American breaking the sound barrier. And they put that picture on, that was the end of the tour. And literally, I'm walking out that door, and it hit me. Well, wait a minute. Why'd they stop there? I get the privilege of representing in the 4th District of Ohio, a town, Wapakoneta, Ohio, hometown of Neil Armstrong. Why'd they stop there? 22 years later, 1969, another American, another Ohioan, stepped on the moon. So think about that. In 66 years, two guys flying a few hundred feet to putting another American on the moon. It's an amazing country. And in spite of all the BS that happens in Washington, it is a great country, the greatest one ever. And it seems to me our charge, people in public policy, people in public life, but frankly, successful business leaders, we're making a difference all across our economy. Our charge is real basic. Straight from scriptures. My favorite scripture verse, 2 Timothy 4:7. Paul's the old guy giving advice to the young guy, and he says, fight the good fight, finish the course, keep the faith. And it is a verse that I think is about America. Fight, finish, keep. Words of action, words of meaning, words that are associated with our great country. And That's what we got to do, both in Washington and outside of Washington. Thank you all for giving me a chance to say a few things about the Freedom Caucus. If you're coming down to D.C., look us up. I always tell folks, you get past the politician, it's a pretty nice town. Thank you.